Hello, this is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about biblical prophecy, or more specifically, the scary end times biblical prophecy, or even more accurately, the failed apocalyptic prophecy of Jesus proving he was a false prophet and that Christianity was rubbish, or more surgically precise, the false claim that Jesus was a false prophet based upon a fundamental misunderstanding of what Jesus was even saying, and rooted in an understanding of who Jesus was that would not be extant. I'm bringing this up because I recently had a conversation about this topic with an idiot atheist, and I'm sorry, but they keep going on about me being cognitively biased, making fun of my random capitals, just like how stupid I am since I shouldn't type drunk, or because I'm an idiot who doesn't know proper grammar, even though I've already told them it's not random. I capitalize nouns, modifiers, and certain key terms to help my eyes focus. Due to being legally blind and dyslexic, they don't care. They will capitalize on my disabilities, and of course the usual rubbish that they get from their religion. And by the way, I know I'm an idiot for saying atheism is a religion. I know atheism isn't a religion. I know atheism is a lack of belief in a god. I know that atheism is a religion like bald as a hair color. I know that atheism is a religion like not playing sports is a sport. I know atheism is a religion like not collecting stamps is a hobby. But there's two problems with saying that. First, I didn't say atheism is a religion, and that's never been my position, even though the stupid atheists that I typically interact with, who rely on cruel, hate-filled insults and constant, degrading language, will never admit that my point is not atheism is a religion, because they're stupid. At best, I'm going to get them saying that I'm a liar who called atheism a religion, then denied calling it a religion, or claimed I wasn't going to call atheism a religion, then turned around and called it a religion. Because in their delusional, stupid atheist minds, they think that you only have two options, which is black and white thinking, which is what they accuse religious people of. They think that either atheism is a religion, or else atheists are not religious. This is the sort of linguistic sleight of hand they like playing. And in reality, that isn't my position at all. And even if it were, even if I thought atheism were a religion, you can't prove me wrong about atheism being a religion by simply telling me I'm wrong and telling me atheism is not a religion, and then saying something like atheism is a religion like bald is a hair color, atheism is a religion like not playing sports is a sport, atheism is a religion like not collecting stamps is a hobby. In fact, repeating those slogans is actually counter to the point that they are trying to make, since repeating these slogans shows that they are, in fact, reciting dogma. The same thing, ironically, happens when they say atheists are a herd of cats. When all of them say herd of cats, instead of seeing them as a herd of cats going everywhere, you see them as lemmings jumping off of a cliff together. They very, very, very clearly are all quoting each other and are not really free thinkers. Which is also why you hear the repeated lie that atheism is a lack of belief in a god in the first place. Although, to be fair, the bloke I was speaking to didn't actually say atheism is a lack of belief in a god, and denied that it was. So that is at least to his credit. However, he obviously believed in a lot of the other rubbish. He was a Christ mither, which is typical these days, even though it's absolutely nonsense. And he never really questioned the narratives he's given, because a lot of the things that you hear really are contradictory. And I'll go into that in a future video, but for now, I'm just going to give this very brief overview, since I haven't made a video in a couple of weeks, and I intend on revisiting this topic in greater detail later. But it had to do with something that even Bart Ehrman, who should know better, says, and that is that Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet. Now, this bloke actually outright admitted that nothing I said would change his mind. Of course, he also claimed nothing he said would change my mind. The narrative, of course, being that he uses reason, logic, science, critical thinking, and has come to the truth and won't change his mind because he's seen the truth, whereas I'm simply suffering from cognitive biases, and since I believe Jesus is God and can't be wrong, I'm simply making excuses. But my faith is so deep, I just can't be brought to reason. And of course, he kept talking about his being the natural reading of the text. The problem is, when it comes to Jesus saying that the kingdom of God would come in the lifetime of people who serve him, or he said specifically, this generation shall not pass till they see these things, and is referring to the coming kingdom, he only gave me two options, claiming that Luke tried to fix the problem because they realized the kingdom wasn't coming on schedule, so he tried to spiritualize it. And those are my two options. Either take it literally and think that the apocalyptic end of the world would happen with God's day of retribution. Jesus would return a second time, build the New Jerusalem, and rule from the New Jerusalem the kingdom of God, which would rule everything. Or else, I must take Luke's approach and say that it happens spiritually because the kingdom of God is inside of everyone. He got basic facts wrong, even from the point of view of dispensational theology, and it is dispensationalism that he is talking to. It is rather well known, especially today when people don't really understand religion and religious studies or Christianity, and we go mostly by popular media. This is the well-known Left Behind narrative, but I doubt this bloke has read Left Behind, and really I don't think he's read much by way of evangelical Christian or Pentecostal literature on the end times and the rapture and all that, because he's getting basic facts even of their theology wrong. But what's worse is that he's nowhere near right about what this means. I don't try and condemn people's theological views on this channel. I try and remain a bit more neutral. But when it comes to this topic, there really isn't a neutral way of saying it without simply covering all the sides of it. And this bloke was making assumptions about me personally, and that really is irritating from atheists, especially the "I used to be a Christian, I know exactly how you think" sort. You see, even the dispensationalists, mainly found in evangelical or Pentecostal circles, and to be fair, not all evangelicals or Pentecostals believe in dispensational theology, and there are people who believe in dispensationalism who wouldn't rightly be called evangelicals and wouldn't rightly be called Pentecostals either. But for the most part, that's what is popular. But none of them think that at Jesus' second coming, he's going to give us the New Jerusalem. They do believe that at the second coming, Christ will set up his kingdom and rule for 1,000 years. But they believe he will rule from Jerusalem. They do not believe he will rule from the New Jerusalem. This bloke said he will come and build the New Jerusalem, as if it's going to be on earth, when the book of Revelation makes it very plain that the New Jerusalem is a heavenly city, and it is never said to be on earth. It is, of course, true that evangelicals, Pentecostals, and anyone who embraces dispensational theology do believe that at Jesus' second coming he will build the kingdom. But the problem is that this bloke was saying this is what is taught in the Bible, and Luke tried to fix the problem by making it spiritual by saying the kingdom of God is in everyone. This isn't true either. Luke's gospel does not say the kingdom of God is inside everyone. It's only in people who follow the teachings of Jesus Christ. Still, it's obviously an attempt to spiritualize it and make it an invisible spiritual event because the apocalyptic prophecy failed, right? I mean, the religion should have ended right then and there. Jesus said, this generation shall not pass away. A generation is about 40 years. And it didn't happen. So they had to spiritualize it, right? Well, no, because according to this bloke, he repeated the same nonsense about Paul also thinking there was an imminent end times. But Paul very obviously never said anything about the coming kingdom. Unless, of course, you believe all these end times references that Paul made were to the coming kingdom. But therein lies the problem. Because the claim he's making is it's the natural reading and it's very plain and obvious. And yet Paul never says, "Lo, when the kingdom comes at Christ's second coming," or something along those lines. Paul never once refers to the coming of Christ a second time being when we get the kingdom, and in fact refers to the kingdom as something that already exists. And in fact, the bloke I spoke to thought that Luke introduced this spiritualized interpretation, but the interpretation that he's claiming as spiritual is also found in Paul in the book of Romans. Specifically in Romans chapter 14, where Paul says this. I am, by the way, quoting from the Authorized Version, also known as the King James Version, for convenience, and I am quoting verse 17 of chapter 14 of the book of Romans. For the kingdom of God is not meat and drink, but righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Ghost. Note, Paul did not say for the kingdom of God will be, he said is. And he is giving the same spiritual idea that Luke is supposed to have given, that Paul is supposed to not know about, since Paul is expecting the kingdom to be built at Christ's second coming, and that would be an imminent end of the world, according to their narrative. You see a lot of references like this to Paul, or in Paul's writings, and it's obvious that Paul never actually says the kingdom will be built at the second coming. He doesn't really talk much about the kingdom at all, and when he speaks, it is as if it is already here. He talks about Christ reigning, for example. Indeed, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul says that Christ is already seated at the right hand of God. He currently reigns, and he will reign until all enemies are subdued, and the final enemy shall be death. If Christ is already reigning, that means that, well, he's already over the kingdom. That means that, to Paul, Jesus is already king, ruling a kingdom, rather than someone who will return to build a kingdom. That is ultimately the problem with this narrative, because ultimately it commits one fatal mistake, and that is one that this bloke himself mentioned. He asked me if I believe Jesus was God, and points out that because I'm cognitively biased by believing Jesus is God, therefore the Bible can't be wrong, and Jesus can't be wrong. And he even asked me, why is it so hard to admit that? Why is it so hard to admit Jesus was wrong? And he, of course, explained why it was hard, my cognitive biases. I just can't accept Jesus was wrong because I think Jesus is God, so therefore I have to accept that Jesus was right, even when it's obvious he was wrong, and invent excuses where the atheist, free of cognitive biases, can be rational and use critical thinking and know Jesus was wrong about this, but I just can't as a Christian. I think Jesus is God, I think Jesus is infallible, so I come up with excuses. The problem with this is this. He also attributed the belief that Jesus is God to the people hearing Jesus, and it's obvious that in his mind, even though Jesus is the Jesus character, a make-believe mythological figure who never really existed, and the New Testament is fairy tales and all that, that in the fairy tale story, the Jesus character is accepted as God by the people he's talking to, who worship him as the crucified Savior who died on a cross, rose from the dead, and ascended to heaven, speaking to them this prophecy of his second coming and the end days when God's retribution shall come. Unfortunately, this contradicts the chronology of the actual events that are established in the book, and yes, I know it's a badly written fiction. The reason it's split this way is because it's badly written fiction. The very people who accuse me of cognitive biases will use that sort of excuse. But it's not badly written fiction. It's simply not saying what they think it's saying. The prophecies that Jesus makes in Matthew and Mark are very obviously not talking about the end of the world. Because the first thing he says we should expect, it's not the first thing he mentions, which is probably going to get me seen as an idiot, because they'll think the first thing mentioned should be the first thing happened, even though he said this will be a sign that these things will be upon you, so this would be the first thing, would be that the sun and moon would not give their light. Things would go dark. Now, the atheist community especially has a tendency of exaggerating in order to justify their hatred and revilement of Christianity as well as their rejection of it by making it as absurd as possible. But here's the thing. Jesus spoke this prophecy, which we find in Matthew and Mark, 1.5 to 2 years before the crucifixion. No one, not even Jesus, believed he had actually died on a cross and risen from the dead yet, because he hadn't. And while Jesus would have known about the future, his apostles would not. They didn't understand that he was going to die on a cross. And at this point, if Jesus were to start talking to them about the second coming, they would have no frame of reference, no context by which they could use to understand what he was even talking about. Jesus isn't really talking about the second coming. The prophecy is about his death on the cross, his resurrection, the establishment of the church, and the fall of the city of Jerusalem, as well as the destruction of the temple. It is not about a universal judgment on mankind. It is not about God's day of retribution, where the end times happen, or some great cosmic struggle with the Antichrist. It is about the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple by the Romans. It is about the establishment of the church. And if you're one of those sorts to ask, well, that can't be because he explicitly stated a kingdom and coming in power and glory in his kingdom, do keep in mind, the church is the kingdom of Christ on earth. And therein lies the problem with the two options he gave me, either the Matthew and Mark version with a literal apocalypse, which of course didn't happen, or else it's a spiritual event which he called a cop-out because he is an atheist who watches atheist videos on YouTube, and they all call them cop-outs. So it's either the spiritual and invisible Luke version or the literal Mark and Matthew version, and in reality it's the literal both versions. At the crucifixion, we are told that the sun and moon went dark for 3 hours, thus fulfilling that part of the prophecy. And the parts about having to flee to the mountains and flee and pray your departure be not in winter and all that, that isn't talking about the end times and the Antichrist or God's retribution. It is talking about the fall of Jerusalem. And they fled. And as for the kingdom coming in great power and glory, Paul keeps talking about Jesus sitting at the right hand of God in glory already. And if you read the book of Acts, you will see the day of Pentecost being described, where the apostles were given miraculous gifts. They could speak to people no matter what language they are. Everyone understood what they were saying, no matter what language they were speaking. And a flame appeared over their heads, and they won about 3,000 converts that day. The day of Pentecost was the day the church was established. It is the day the kingdom was established. Jesus even told Peter rather famously, when he asked Peter, "Who do people say that I am?" And Peter said, "Some say you are Elias, some say you are John the Baptist, some say you are some prophet or such." And then he asked him, "Who do you say that I am? Who dost thou say?" And Peter said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus said to him, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock shall I build my church. And I shall give you the keys of the kingdom, so that whatever you bind in heaven shall be bound on earth, and what you shall loose in heaven shall be loosed on earth." In that statement, Jesus was very clearly saying that the church and kingdom were the same thing. After all, he said, "I will build my church," and then he said, "I will give you the keys to the kingdom." The church and the kingdom are not two separate, distinct things. The church fathers did not believe the church and the kingdom were separate. And there's no evidence that Jesus did either. And that's why this false prophecy is not actually a false prophecy. Then there's also the fact that in the mythology of a secular humanist religion, which is what they're following, They claimed that there were over 80 or 90 or 150 or so Gospels that the church chose from, picking the one that best suited their narrative. If Jesus had made an obvious false prophecy in Matthew and Mark, the church could have just as easily not picked them to go in the Bible, couldn't they? And yet the church creates a problem by choosing these books. According to the mythology of the modern-day holy religion of atheism, which, by the way, is not the same thing as atheism is a religion, I'm still referring to their form of secular humanism that embraces an obtuse, militant atheism. They'll still say I called atheism a religion regardless. They claim that the Bible we have today is a game of Chinese whispers, we can't know what's in the original, and that the church intentionally rewrote, edited, and altered the Bible. If so, why bother having Luke spiritualize the prophecy when you could just edit it out completely and remove it, or perhaps alter it yourselves? There is no reason why the church, which is, according to them, perfectly willing to edit, alter, and revise the scriptures, as well as pick which books go into the Bible that serve their agenda, to pick two books initially to go into the Bible that would cause them problems, and then subsequently not edit them, or alter them in any way, thus preserving the problem. So either the church was not intentionally editing and altering these texts, or else you have to explain why they left them in. And there is no answer, because this is one of those things that contradicts within the mythology. They want us to believe that there are certain problems, like Jesus being a false prophet, while also believing that the church edited, altered, and rewrote the Bible at will to reflect whatever agendas they had. And yet they did not fix this problem. Why? Why would they leave it in? Well, it's because there is no problem. If you aren't thinking of dispensational theology, if you don't think that the church and kingdom are separate, and if you don't think that Jesus will establish the kingdom in the future at his second coming, but rather think the church is the kingdom that was established already, then there really isn't much of an issue. The entire prophecy was fulfilled. The darkness, the people fleeing, the destruction, and the kingdom coming in great power and glory. All of it happened already. It happened over 2,000 years ago at this point. Or about 2,000 years ago. So this false prophecy of Jesus is actually not a false prophecy. It is one that very obviously was fulfilled. And even from a purely secularist, even anti-Christian view, I would not be able to bring myself to think it was a false prophecy, and still believe that the church didn't just edit it out or alter it, if I was going to go along with that. If the church did not truly believe these are sacred books, and simply chose them to serve an agenda, and if the church was willing to rewrite and edit and alter the books, there is no reason to think that they left them in if these verses really did mean the end of the world should have been 2,000 years ago, or within the lifetime of the apostles. And yet, that is the situation they want us to accept as the reality, and that is simply incongruous with what they're saying about the church and its history. The truth of the matter is, even Bart Ehrman makes this silly mistake, and I understand that he was raised Baptist, and dispensationalism was a very prominent belief within it. But I was raised in the Churches of Christ, which doesn't teach original sin, and yet I understand the doctrine of original sin. So it can't just be that he was raised Baptist. It's very lazy on his part. I know they're going to say, oh, but he's a Bible scholar. They only do that when he's an atheist. They don't seem to care about the credentials of any sort of Christian. But it doesn't matter. There is no reason to think of Jesus as a failed apocalyptic preacher, considering that the very prophecy was understood to have been fulfilled by Eusebius, by Origen, by Clement, by Ignatius. None of the early church fathers, especially the apostolic ones, like Justin Martyr or Ignatius that I just mentioned, or Barnabas, none of them actually referred to the kingdom being a future event or this being a prophecy of the future. And we're not just talking about the church fathers in general. We're talking about the apostolic fathers who spoke of this topic. Never once said it was about a future kingdom and a second coming. That's not to say that they didn't believe the second coming would happen at all. They did. They did believe in Judgment Day. But they didn't believe in the rapture. They didn't believe that the church would be taken up before some 7 years of tribulation and the Antichrist would rule the world and all that. They did have some beliefs about those sorts of things, but not the one that we are familiar with if we know about dispensational theology or the Left Behind book series, which is based upon dispensational ideas. And therein lies the problem that I have with militant atheism. It's not a very intelligent, it's not a very clever position, and it simply seeks to repeat nonsense that its members see on atheist websites and blogs or hear in videos, or occasionally they'll actually read one of the books. But really, in addition to the fact that all of these modern atheists are interconnected to secular humanism, whether they admit it or not, work for professional organizations, many of them are salaried, and we're all supposed to pretend that they're all individuals who merely lack belief in a God and have nothing in common with other atheists, but their lack of belief and just happen to coincidentally be like these other atheists when they are actually working for atheist organizations that clearly state that they exist to promote humanist values like the Secular Student Alliance, which Hemet Mehta and the Mindshift fellow and others actually work for today, and how it's a branch of the American Humanist Association, or how the Council for Secular Humanism merged with the Richard Dawkins Foundation and created the Center for Inquiry. You'll notice all of these interconnections. When they were getting their ideas from places like the American Humanist Association, or like American Atheists, or like the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And in turn, the things you see online were quotes from things that, even before they had the internet, that you would see in their magazines, or in their various newsletters, or in books published by Prometheus Press, and Prometheus Press is the publication arm of the American Humanist Association. And the American Humanist Association has deep ties to the National Secular Society of Great Britain. It was effectively invented as an American version of that. It wasn't a direct splinter from it, but it was definitely inspired by it. And the arguments they're using ultimately go back to the Rationalist Press Association in the 19th century, especially the Thinker's Library. And when these books were published, people kept copying their ideas in various newsletters or other books that kept being published over time. And that seems to be where most of them really stopped their investigation. They don't even really know about the 19th century freethought movement, or the Rationalist Press Association, or the Thinker's Library. But that doesn't change the fact that these materials were copied and quoted from to create the initial articles for places like the American Humanist Association and its newsletters, and other people would quote the people who quoted the Thinker's Library, or other people would quote the people who quoted other works in the Rationalist Press, and so on. And the ideas got passed on that way. So you may think, for instance, that you're getting your idea from Matt Dillahunty or Alan Raw when you're really getting it from Joseph McCabe or Charles Bradlaugh via this transmission. And they don't really stop and question whether or not what they're saying is actually true. And when it comes to the rank-and-file atheists, this is par for the course for them. They're not really any different than the religious people they mock and ridicule. They'll just believe without evidence whatever their leaders say, whilst denying they have leaders. But when it comes to someone like Bart Ehrman, they hold him up as a Bible scholar, as if that makes him infallible. And Ehrman himself does not, at least to my knowledge, address the fact that the early church did indeed believe that Jesus fulfilled this prophecy already, and that the church was the kingdom. And this isn't really a cop-out. This isn't really a product of my cognitive biases. This is what the church fathers believed. So even if they were applying it as a cop-out, or they had cognitive biases, it doesn't mean I do by quoting them. And incidentally, they didn't have cognitive biases. If you actually read the prophecy and understand it wasn't the Lord Jesus Christ who had died on a cross, risen from the dead, and ascended to heaven who was saying this, but it's rather the Rabbi Jesus who was traveling in a ministry around 2 years before he was crucified saying this, then it's fairly obvious that this prophecy is not about the end of the world. It's about the darkness of the crucifixion, and it's about the turmoil that the Romans were visited upon the city of Jerusalem and the temple, and it is about the establishment of the kingdom of God, which is the church. It is very obvious that this is the natural reading, since it is the chronological one, and it takes into account the chronological development of events. It takes into account that Jesus said all of this before the crucifixion. And it accounts for the things that Paul says about Jesus already ruling and already being on the right hand of God. And it really is the one that makes the most sense, but it only makes sense if you actually understand that. And most of the atheists that I speak to today really don't have a concept of chronology. They know that there's a basic story of Jesus being a traveling preacher who got crucified, born of a virgin, grew up, taught at the temple and all that, but they don't really think in those terms. They think if it's in the New Testament especially, then it must be the crucified and risen Lord Jesus they're talking about, and the people he's talking to must worship him as God and think his death on the cross cleansed them of their sins. And in reality, that's not what happened. Just like the bloke who I was talking to actually thought I believed in this apocalyptic end times prophecies. And he actually said, "You believe this, don't you?" And he wasn't really asking. He already told me he's not going to listen. And of course I don't. I'm not a dispensationalist. I've never been an evangelical. I know the Churches of Christ are listed as evangelical on some sites, but they aren't really evangelical. And it's not just a matter of them moving the moment when you get saved from when you pray and invite Jesus to your heart to the moment of baptism. They don't really operate the way evangelicals do. And I will remind you, I'm not really connected to the Churches of Christ any longer. I'm not saying this to defend them. It's just I don't like the false information. However, having said all that, it's pretty obvious that they don't really understand what it is they're talking about. It's very obvious they don't really understand that when Jesus was talking, this was not the risen Lord Jesus who had been crucified, had risen from the dead, and who had ascended to heaven. At this point, his followers see him as a rabbi who is traveling about. But this sort of mentality, which they don't understand, certainly explains why people like the Liar of Zod or Pastor Klink can gain so many followers, because they can say nonsense like, "I could see a Jesus-like character being a Greg Locke-like character." Well, I can't. This is first century Judah under Roman occupation. There is no way that you're going to get Jesus being a Greg Locke-like character. They would not have allowed that. They would not have allowed megachurches. They would not have allowed this sort of thing. And of course, they didn't have the concept of religion we did anyway, which does not mean they were atheists. It just means that the idea of religion as a private belief system or beliefs about the supernatural, all the things we associate with religion as a clear concept, really wasn't how this was being approached in the ancient world. And you can see Kavanaugh for that. I am not making that up. You can read what he said. I'm not saying trust everything he said, he's infallible, but I'm not wanting this video to go too much longer, so I can't really go into an elaborate explanation. At any rate, I don't have much else to say. But I will say this. The atheist community is fond of saying that the religious, by which they just mean Christians, they claim to mean all religion, but it's obvious they're just focused on Christianity, just as it is obvious that they don't focus on Christianity because it's the most popular religion where they live, that their movement is actually just anti-Christian. But they like accusing Christians of cognitive bias. and acting as if atheism, being a lack of belief in a god, does not generate cognitive biases when it's obvious that they are indeed cognitively biased. This is why, for instance, you will have Catholics agreeing with this argument of Jesus being a failed apocalypse preacher, even though the Catholic Church would agree with me, not with the evangelicals with the rapture. And this is why you'll also hear people who claim that they used to be Catholic talking as if the Catholic Church embraces sola scriptura, or sola fide, or that the Bible is the sole source of authority in matters of faith and practice, and that one is saved by faith alone. These are not Catholic ideas, and yet people who claim to have been Catholic will act as if they are. And therein lies the issue that I have with militant atheism. None of these people actually know what they're talking about. Well, I'll come back and make a better video on this topic later. Until then, I shall take my leave. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.